the first time Tom Darling, who was the manager at CHML, the first time he called me, Dorson Shoes was opening up in Hamilton, Frank Dorson Shoes. And he said, I used to use the name Bev Marsh. He said, Bev, we'd like you to be the on-spot reporter. And I knew Frank Dorson very well. They were personal friends of ours. So I said, take the peanuts away.
They're good, they're not in the way, actually.
Oh, so they said, we won't tell Frank Dorson that Molly Beube is Bev Marsh. And I walked in, and that's where I used to buy my shoes. And he said, oh, hi, Molly. He said, listen, stay. He says, we're going to have an interviewer here, and we're just opening the store, and listen, stay, and you'll see what's going on. I said, okay. He said, she should be here. You know, she should be here any time. I said, she is here. Of course, it was a lot of fun. I also did the commentary for the Queen when she visited Hamilton from the old City Hall.
Is that right?
And that was exciting. So then, after I did those few things, Tom Darling asked me if I would sit in for Jane Grey while she took this plane load of people to England. And I did that. And prior to that, when Hadassah was having any kind of bazaar or function, they would ask me to be the interviewee. And so Gordy Tapp interviewed me one day. Tom Darling happened to see the interview, and from that day on, he kept giving me little jobs. Eventually, he gave me the Bev Marsh show, which I did in the mornings.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Is that right? So, Bev Marsh, do you also remember when there was a Jewish radio program in Hamilton?
Of course, I was on it.
You were?
Of course. The Harry Harris Jewish Hour. And it was Irving Zucker's father, who was very instrumental in that particular show. And whoever went on the Jewish Hour, he would invite them back to the Zucker home for lunch or dinner or breakfast, depending on what time it was. And Mrs. Zucker would never know how many people were coming for lunch or breakfast or dinner. And she would just have to add more water to the soup because they would come in droves. And the best shows were held in her home after the radio show. And we'd have all that wonderful Yiddish music, and everybody would do their shtick, and it was just memorable.
That Yiddish radio show was on sometime in the 40s, am I right?
Well, I came to Hamilton in 47, okay. So it would have been, you know, I cannot remember whether I did that before I married Harry Beube, because I married Harry in 47, but I had been to Hamilton a number of times. Ken Sobel had booked me in to do Bonds or JNF, I don't know, one of the Jewish organizations, and I performed that night. So I had been in Hamilton a couple of times. Now, whether I did the Jewish Hour before 47, I'm pressed to remember.
Molly, where were you from?
Toronto.
And when Ken Sobel used to book you, what would you do in these performances?
I would do I do an hour and a half of stand-up Yiddish comedy.
Can you give us a taste of that?
Oh, my goodness. Let me see. Well, I'm not sure just what you would want. Do you want a recitation? Do you want anything? I used to do a little recitation that I had learned when I went to Hebrew school. I may remember it, I may not. It's about a little boy who who steals into his grandfather's bedroom to take his snuff box. And it goes something like this. Zede, wie ist dein Tabak, Puschke? I'm sorry. Zede, wie ist dein Tabak, Puschke? Ich will euch a Schmeck. Geh, du bist a Stiffer, sagt er. Und geht weg. Dacht ich, als du sedet schlafen, keiner wird nicht sein, will ich auf die spitzen Finger in sein Stüber rein, aussuchen die Puschke Tabak in seinen langen Rock, anmessen die große Brillen, umgehen mit sein Stock. Tabak will ich keine schmecken, wieviel noch ich will ich euch sehen, wie Zede, ein schönes Spiel. Schau. Die Seide muss schon schlafen, bin ich bald beim Tier. Spanne rein zu ihm und kämme es herzlich nicht kein Rehr. Hab ich Seides Rock von Bettel, sich die Brillen aus, nehm die Brillen mitten stecken, in ich gehe raus. Stell ich sich an Kegenspiegel, in sein langen Rock, mit die Brillen auf die Augen, in mein Hand dem Stock. Will ich öffnen die Puschke, kenn ich nicht, zu schwer. Reiß ich sie mit aller Keuches, dreh sie hin und her, bis es reißt sich auf den Deckel mit der größten Prall, flieten Nasen in die Augen, Tabak, bitte, go, abschied, Zede, Giecher, komm mal her, hier, abschied, die Augen, Zede, ich will das Ton nicht mehr. Kommt der Zede schnell zu laufen. Hi, ha, abschied, was ist das? So bitter in die Augen, bitter da nass. Aber der sagt was naschen Tabak, als der Zede schlafen? Ich weiß, bin gewähnt schlechter, hat mich Gott gestrafen. Abschied!
Very nice.
I can't believe I remembered.
Very nice. Of course, Wendy didn't understand any of it.
Oh, really?
Well, he's fluent. He's fluent.
You speak Yiddish?
Well, after I converted, I learned language. I did. No, I do. I do speak Yiddish.
And you could follow what I said?
Every word.
I didn't. I was worried about you. I thought maybe Wendy could follow everything I said.
No, I could follow every single word. Doesn't matter. I
His
speak
father
Yiddish.
was a Yiddish poet.
Yeah. So you come from Hamilton, from Toronto.
I do.
To Hamilton in 1947.
Mm-hmm.
What was the Jewish community? Do you remember?
Oh, it was so wonderful. It was so wonderful. I knew everybody. Everybody knew everybody. And I was just welcomed so warmly by the community because of Harry Beube. He was so loved in this community. He was with Great West Life. And it didn't take long before they found out that I did this Yiddish stuff. And so I was invited everywhere to perform, and I enjoyed that tremendously. And one thing led to another, and then I did puppetry for children. And when I got on television in Toronto, I had, because of the puppets, I was invited to go on the Uncle Bobby show, which was broadcast across Canada. And then I used those puppets to go up to the hospitals where the children, especially up Shidok, you had Eskimo children who didn't get home for a year, 2 years, or whatever length of time it took in those days before they could go back. And the Eskimo children were very shy. They didn't speak the language. And it wasn't easy for the teacher. They had one teacher who had access to all the different wards, and she would teach all the grades. And she would speak to them through her loudspeaker, and she'd say whatever his or her name was. How are you doing with your mathematics? And they'd say, good, or I'm having a problem. And so she could teach many grades that way. Well, then I thought, well, if they can't get out of bed, wouldn't it be wonderful if they each had a puppet? It would be their little friend. And so I believe I contacted, it was either B'nai B'rith or it was one of the Jewish organizations. And they supplied a puppet for each child who was bedridden. And then when I heard that they're shy and it's been difficult for them to learn to speak English, and I thought, well, maybe through the puppets they won't be so shy, because when you're using a puppet, it's amazing. You've got the puppet on your hand, and whatever the puppet says, you don't think you're responsible. You think, well, the puppet is saying, I'm not saying it. So I arranged for each child to get a puppet, and then I think her name was Mrs. Manzer or something like that. It's a long time ago. And she invited me up to a Christmas concert. And lo and behold, all these children who just couldn't learn English that easily were doing Christmas plays in English, because it wasn't them that had the accent or didn't speak clearly, it's the puppet. And so I did that with the children in the hospitals, and I also did it with children who were a little slow.
Tell me something else, if you can. I just want to get back to the Jewish community for one second. It was a very, very warm community. Very. And were there synagogues in town? Synagogues? Yeah. Oh, sure. Hess Street Synagogue, I think was the oldest, but you'd have to speak to someone who was born here. In my time, Beth Jacob was built, and the Reform Temple was active. But Beth Jacob, it wasn't built for the first time, it was rebuilt. That's where you went? That's where I went, that's where I go.
Can you talk a bit about life at Beth Jacob in the heyday and its prime?
As I remember it mostly, well, the first time I went to Beth Jacob was right after I had given birth to my eldest son, and he was born in '48. And I have to just share a funny story with you. I was sitting in the pews, and at that time, the men and women were sitting separately. And sitting behind me was Dr. Levine's wife. What's her name, Wendy?
Which Dr. Levine?
The ophthalmologist. Isn't that awful? She's at Shalom Village now. Lil Levine.
Lil Levine, yeah.
Who is a very funny lady. She's sitting behind me. And the last thing that Lillian Levine was ever interested in was fashion. And I had to get to synagogue. It was Neil was born September 27th, and this was shortly after. It was after the summer, but I didn't have any time to go out and get a hat or whatever. I had a straw hat and I wore it. And she's sitting behind me and she taps me on the shoulder. She said, and I turned around and she said, I didn't know her that well at that time. And she said, it really isn't proper for thee, Mrs. Beube, to wear a straw hat after September. And of course we always kid about it because who cared? Nobody even cared. The next recollection I have was everybody who was involved in building Beth Jacob Synagogue. And Harry was very involved at that time, and Ken Sobel and all the Goldblatts. And Leah Levine,
who was my accompanist whenever I did Yiddish theater, who unfortunately is not with us any longer, we decided to have the first tea at Beth Jacob. And so at that time, you didn't have a Maxi Min's catering. And so we booked someone from Toronto. And it was going to be February the 14th. It was sort of going to be a Valentine tea. And Lee and I knew all the women, all the Jewish women in Hamilton, and everybody was invited. And so we had arranged with a piano player and a violinist, and this lady from Toronto was bringing in sandwiches and cakes and cookies. And it's the day of the tea. The piano player came, the violinist came, we had the room magnificently decorated, and where I used to do a lot of baking, I decided this time I wouldn't. And all I made was a beautiful cake for the center of the table, in the shape of a girl with a full gown, you know. And I did that up brown, and that was fun. That's all we had. The tea was starting at 3 o'clock. It is now 1 o'clock, and there is no caterer. And I thought, she has to come from Toronto. Did she not allow more time? And I called her, and I said, it's Molly Beube. And I said, what are you still doing at home? Well, she said, we're busy making your sandwiches and your cakes for tomorrow. I said, but the tea is today. She said, girls, that tea is today. She said, we're on our way. People arrived at 3 o'clock. I didn't so much as have a cookie, or I had absolutely nothing in that place. And I remember calling Maxi Mintz. Well, Benny Mintz was alive at the time. And may he rest in peace, he said, don't worry. If she doesn't get there on time, you just call us and we'll put our staff on sandwiches. I said, what am I going to do for cakes and cookies? I said, you know what? You're known for your pies. I said, bring out platters of different pies. He said, it'll be ready and don't worry about it. I remember Mrs. Barnett, who was very visual in Hamilton, and she too is gone. And she came in, and because we thought people would be milling around, we didn't set up a lot of tables. We just set up a few chairs for the elderly, for them to sit. Well, everybody must have thought, I guess we just sit and they'll bring us our cookies and sandwiches. She came over to me and she said, Molly, would you like me to ask them to set up more chairs? And I thought, well, I've got to get her off my back. I said, yes, would you do that, please? So I knew till she found the janitor, till she found the people that would look after Mrs. Barnett. Everybody came in, and Leah Levine and I stood at the door, and we greeted everyone. Finally, Leah's daughter standing at the door, and she went, they had just arrived. And they set out those sandwiches, and they set out those cookies, and the music is playing. There was nothing ready. And suddenly all the waitresses walked in with platters. It looked like it had been planned that way. So that was a fun thing. And I just have wonderful memories about Beth Jacob. I used to perform for their every function.
Were you in Muriel Bach's plays?
I believe I was. I can't go back that far. I was in so many things. But Muriel put on some wonderful plays.
You knew a lot of the people at
Oh,
Beth
yeah.
Jacob, right?
Oh, yes.
Everybody knew everybody?
Everybody knew everybody.
Because it was small, or it's just the way it was in those days?
It's just the way it was in those days. And if you belonged to Beth Jacob, you knew everybody. And because I was so active in all the different organizations, I knew the people who didn't belong to Beth Jacob. I performed for every synagogue. I performed for every chapter. I performed for every organization, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Do you remember any Jewish organizations? Like what kinds of Jewish organizations?
Well, there
were
was Hadassah, of course.
Oh, I see.
There was B'nai B'rith. There was the Jewish women, what's that?
Pioneer Women?
Pioneer Women.
So you would perform at their fundraisers to help attract people so they could raise funds for their...
Oh, yes. I've
and
helped.
And you would perform for free? You wouldn't...
I would perform for free. I performed everywhere. Here, Toronto, surrounding areas. It was a mitzvah. But then I also performed professionally when I went out of town or out of country.
Where did you learn Yiddish?
From the time I was 9 years, well, my parents spoke Yiddish at home. We all spoke Yiddish at home. But I attended a shula. A shula, unlike a Talmud Torah. And I think that a shula concentrates more on Yiddish than Hebrew. And although we did take Hebrew and Chumash and all those subjects, the focus, I think, was Yiddish.
Which shula did you go to?
Farbund in Toronto on Cecil Street. And I attended Farbund till I guess I went about 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we did were declamatsias, which are recitations. And that was one of them, the one that I did for you. And then my father, who would get the Jewish papers, he would look through the paper, and they always had a poetry of some kind. And he'd call me in from time to time, and he'd say, "Molly, I think this is a good piece." He'd read it to me because he could read quicker than I, he could read that Yiddish faster than I could at that time. And I said, "That's it, I like it." He'd cut it out. I'd go up to my room. I would not come down until it was memorized. Then I came down. I would do it for the family, and I did it at every family function. And then I think I was 16 when I did my first Yiddish professional one at the Victory Theater in Toronto on Spadina Avenue.
Did you ever speak Yiddish in Hamilton to anyone? Do you remember?
When people came to the door, or if I was in a group where there were older people who could only speak Yiddish, I spoke Yiddish. As a matter of fact, this wasn't Hamilton, this was Toronto. I was about 13, and at Passover, Jewish organizations used to do Passover meals. And I used to serve these Passover meals. And a nurse came up to me one day and she said, do you speak Yiddish? And I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "We have a very Orthodox patient, and he refuses to eat the hospital food. And we cannot impress upon him that he must not eat the food that is being served." You can imagine knedel and all those fat foods that are served at Passover. He cannot eat those foods. And could you tell him in Yiddish the importance? He's a very sick man. So I went in to him. He was laying there with a yarmulke. And in Yiddish, I told him what the nurse had said to me. And he said to me in Yiddish, "Kind meins, my child, wenn ich weiß, als ich will sterben die heutige Nacht, if I knew I was to die this night, ich will nicht essen, zere essen, ich will essen, Pesach essen. I won't eat their food, I would eat Passover food." And that was it, and that was his dedication. So when I came to Hamilton, people knew that I spoke Yiddish fluently, and I would speak to the older Jewish people, and of course we'd get together, and sometimes we'd have an evening of just Yiddish.
Really?
And that was funny. So yes, I had a lot of fun with Yiddish. I still do.
Yeah, well, there are fewer and fewer people who, as you know.
As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons I stopped performing. When I came to Hamilton and performed, even back then, I'd be up on stage performing, and I'd see people interpreting to other people. What did she say? What did she say? And I would stop and I'd say, I tell you, you should have gone to Shula, and then you'd understand what I'm saying. I said, if you will wait till after the show, I'd be happy to interpret for you. Because it was distracting seeing it. And so I saw it even then. And then as the years went by, it got worse. And it got to a point where so few people understood Yiddish. What was the use of doing Yiddish? It was too bad, because it's such a colorful language. But my best audiences were Hamilton. Yeah.
Can you talk about some memorable personalities from your Hamilton years and people that stand out in your mind as having made an impact on you and on the community in general?
If you had given me some time, you know, I'll tell you something. Great names and great personalities. I am impressed by people in general. They don't have to be famous. They have to have heart. They have to be honest. And names don't impress me. People impress me. So I would say that throughout my life in Hamilton, I met so many, not necessarily famous people. To me, they were famous.
Did any of them run a good delicatessen?
They all ran good delicatessens. They were wonderful delicatessens, especially on York Street, the one we always went to. That's where you just met everybody.
Which one did you always go to?
Well, we always went to the one on York Street. It's the one that stands out in my mind most. And I guess it was taken over by different people from time, the Bulls, the Boleslavskis. But that's when I first came to Hamilton. And it was quite a meeting place. And everybody shopped there. It was great fun.
Were there other stores on York Street besides the deli?
You have to understand, I came in '47, so to get the York Street history, you would have to go to people who were York Street and lived there, and that was their whole milieu, you know.
No, you're wonderful. You remember a lot.
I do?
I thought so.
I think it's the short memory that goes first.
That's what they say.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the fact that you can recite, you know, this recitation about the topic portion.
That's the professionalism in me. It just came to me. If I try to do it another time, I'm sure I couldn't remember it.
Do you know everyone at the Beth Jacob today? You said you go.
I hardly know, unless they were there in the early years. I don't know anybody. I know the old timers,
Right.
me, my age group.
The people in their 50s? Is that what?
How about people in their 80s?
Oh, really?
Oh, sure.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Well, you lived on Queen Street.
I did.
Yeah. So, in that era, your kids were growing up in the 50s. That's my era.
That's right.
Can you say something about that era, the 50s in Hamilton, the social scene, family life?
Family life was, I think, family life more so than it is today. You know, I'm not a professional in that area. I'm not in everybody's home to see what their family life is like now. I can only talk about my own life and my friends' homes. But to my recollection, that's where a lot of it took place. There weren't so many distractions as there are today. There weren't so many organizations. When I say organizations, I don't necessarily mean Jewish organizations, but situations where children are pulled for different things, and you drop in for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if you have time. But in those days, that was the entertainment. Families got together, and that was more what I was used to in my Toronto life. But on Queen Street, where I lived, my children used to play outside on the street. They'd be flatter than pancakes today if they played out on the street. In fact, when I sold my house in 88, in 88, I thought they better not show this house at 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock. I couldn't get into my driveway. And my children used to play right on the road. Of course, the mountain wasn't built up at that time. So things have changed.